This is a 3,500-ton frigate. That was the flagship vessel of Ukraine's, I would say, relatively small navy until it was sunk. Not by Russian forces, actually, but by Ukraine itself. The ship had been docked for repairs in the port city of Mykolaiv and on the Black Sea coast when the war broke out last week. And the captain of the ship actually feared that those repairs would not be finished in time to prevent the crown jewel of Ukraine's navy from falling into Russian hands. He did not want to take that risk. So he basically carried out orders to sink the ship. Ukraine's defense minister described the captain's predicament this way, saying it is hard to imagine a more difficult decision for a courageous man and his crew, but we will build a new fleet. Russian forces are waging, as we heard, an all-out assault across the southern region of Ukraine, which is the only region of Ukraine that actually has access to the sea. Kherson, the first Ukrainian city to be captured by Russian forces, is quickly running out of medical supplies. Mariupol, also in the southern part of the country, has been under siege, cut off from access to the water, power, food supplies. Now it's going on for days. In the southern city of Odessa, where we just got that live report, the population there is actually getting ready to mount a defense of their city after unverified reports suggest a fleet of Russian warships heading in their direction. That is the situation right now in southern Ukraine. But the assault by Putin's army in the northern part of the country, while horrifying in its own right, is actually moving much, much slowly. A 40-mile convoy of Russian troops remains stalled outside the capital city of Kyiv. And despite the hellish shelling that the capital and Kharkiv that we have seen night after night, some U.S. officials are actually reportedly surprised by the risk-averse approach that Russia has taken with its vast air power against Ukraine's much smaller air force. As one retired three-star Air Force general told Reuters, the Russians are discovering that coordinating multi-domain operations is not easy and that they are not as good as they presumed they were. What should we expect to see in the coming days as Putin continues his siege against the people of Ukraine? Joining us now for more on that, Rob Lee, former Marine Corps infantry officer and senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Rob, it's good to see you again. Thanks for joining us. Let's assess this. What do you think it is that Russian forces, they're doing better in the south, it seems, than they are in the north? I'm curious to get your thoughts on why that might be. And is that a sign of Russia and its offensive capabilities in the south, or a sign of better Ukrainian forces and posture in the north?
Oh, thanks for having me. So I think it's a combination of things, but I think one of them is that Ukrainian forces have decided what are the strategic areas they have to defend, and what areas can they kind of trade, time for space. And so I think that's what they're doing in the south. As you gave a very good kind of briefing of what's going on. Ultimately, they're continuing to advance in the south towards Mykolaiv. They took the city of Erhodon yesterday, where the nuclear plant is, pushing towards Zaporizhia. And then obviously Mariupol is still surrounded in the southeast. But as we've seen the last few days, the big cities in the northeast have not fallen. So Kharkiv, Sumy, Chernigov, and obviously Kyiv. And Ukrainian forces are still holding those. And essentially from now on, it's difficult for Ukraine's military to fight a conventional fight with the Russian military. But if it wins certain cities, it negates a lot of the strengths of the Russian military. And I think that's what their kind of strategy is for going on.
Do you have a sense of how, at this current moment, the Ukrainian military is managing its supply lines? I mean, what happens to Ukraine's military if Russia does manage to cut off their access to the sea? We know that the U.S. and Western countries are trying to resupply various Ukrainian positions. Do we know if that is happening by airlift, by land route, by sea?
So I'm not sure. And one thing that's really notable about this conflict is that there's much more information about what Russia's doing than there is about the Ukrainian military. And I think there are a variety of reasons about that. But as long as the western border of Ukraine is open to these NATO members, ultimately NATO can continue to supply it. And so even if I think the naval access is cut off, that land border will still be very significant. And ultimately Russia doesn't really have any easy way of cutting that off for the time being, given that their land forces aren't near it. And in addition, Ukraine's air defenses are still capable. Their air force is still operating. And so Russia still can't operate with impunity in Western Ukraine to kind of interdict any of those supply lines.
Yeah, and that brings up a really interesting question about the airspace above Ukraine. I mean, I have seen the Russian military operate in Syria. I think it tipped the balance in that fight between the Syrians and the opposition. But Ukraine's airspace, as you said, remains contested, and I think it has a lot of people scratching their heads. Why do you think we are not seeing even more aggression from Russia's much larger and presumably at one point a pretty sophisticated Air Force?
So it's still very surprising. And I think at this point, we have to kind of look at the capabilities of the Russian Air Force and start, questioning whether or not they're capable of doing certain operations that, say, the U.S. Air Force is capable of. And it's pretty clear they aren't, right? And so their ability to suppress or destroy enemy air defenses has struggled to do so. They've struggled to knock out the Ukrainian Air Force. The Ukrainian Air Force continues to wreak havoc on their supply lines, including with those TB2 unmanned combat aerial vehicles. And so it appears that the Russian Air Force is having tremendous difficulties here. And I think one of the important things to remember in previous conflicts, in 2014, 2015, the Russian Air Force didn't really play much of a role in Donbass, mostly because of plausible deniability reasons for Russia. And in Syria, it has played a key role, but they haven't gone against a capable air defense system, right? And so it's basically been operating with relative impunity for most of those areas, and then just working on the targeting process. But right now, this operation is much, much more complex. It's much larger, and you have much larger Russian ground forces on the ground that need that kind of aerial support. And so all those factors make it more difficult for the Russian Air Force to be as effective as as I thought they would be. And that's certainly one of the really kind of surprising lessons from this war so far.